started on time. So, ladies and gentlemen, my dear colleagues, journalists, a very warm welcome to the press conference of the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights press conference. Please let me introduce my colleagues here at the table. Ambassador Ursula Gacek is heading this mission. She's the head of mission. Masha Januszewicz is her deputy, and I'm Elma Schiaric. I'm the media analyst on this mission. I will give the floor now to our ambassador to present some of our preliminary findings and conclusions. You will have the opportunity to ask questions later, and this also counts for the colleagues joining us on the Zoom link. So I give now the floor to Ambassador Gacek, and please.
Thank you very much, Elma. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and particularly a warm welcome to representatives of the media, both domestic and international. I'd like to give you, first of all, a brief overview of our findings and conclusions of the 9th July early presidential election here in Uzbekistan. While the election was technically well prepared, it took place in a political environment lacking genuine competition. Ongoing reforms provided some improvement in line with our previous recommendations, but substantial changes are still needed to provide a sound legal basis for the conduct of democratic elections. The Central Election Commission, who I also welcomed to this press conference, undertook measures to increase the transparency of the process and implemented its mandate efficiently, but further safeguards for the independence of lower-level commissions are needed. In an environment where fundamental freedoms and the right to stand for office remain restricted, registered candidates were able to campaign freely. The low-key campaign lacked meaningful engagement with voters, and candidates refrained from presenting alternative political views. The introduction of social measures and new projects gave the incumbent an undue advantage and blurred the line between party and state. Further reforms are needed to remove limitations and allow for the full participation of civil society in election processes. Online media provided some space for the discussion of social issues, but restricted legal provisions and interference with editorial independence of the media led to an absence of analytical reporting, undermining the voters' ability to make an informed choice. Election day yesterday was calm, but serious irregularities were observed, and important safeguards were often not followed during voting, counting, and tabulation, challenging the integrity of the process. So please permit me to give you now a little more detail on these points that I have raised. Firstly, on what we observed here in Tashkent, but also via our teams of long-term observers in all the regions in Uzbekistan since the first part of June when we all arrived here. Yesterday's presidential election, as you know, followed constitutional reform processes widely promoted as intending to enhance various rights and freedoms and provide some improvements. However, many reforms are still in the process of being implemented. During this election, the right of citizens to exercise fundamental freedoms of association, assembly, and expression remained excessively circumscribed by legislation and in practice. The OSCE's Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, ODM, has made several long-standing recommendations key to a democratic process, including recommendations specifically related to the regulation and exercise of these fundamental freedoms. These recommendations remain outstanding. There have been some revisions of the Constitution, as I already mentioned, and as well as of the election code. And in this process, some prior ODA recommendations were addressed. Overall, however, the current legal framework has yet to fully provide a sound basis for the conduct of democratic elections. Now let me say a few words about the election administration. The technical preparations for the election were handled effectively despite the compressed timeline, and this included an extended public holiday just a few days before the election, and legal deadlines were mainly met. The Central Election Commission conducted regular sessions and started publicly disclosing some information on electoral disputes for this election, contributing to the transparency of the process. While overall informative and interactive, the training sessions given to lower level commissions did not sufficiently address previously observed malpractices and important safeguards. Despite a long-standing ODIHR recommendation, the independence and neutrality of lower-level election administration remained negatively impacted by the prominence of mahallas closely aligned with state and local administration in various aspects of the election process. Over 19.5 million voters were registered in the final voter lists. Recent constitutional changes lifted the blanket ban on voting rights of those declared legally incapable, which is in line with international standards and prior ODIHR recommendations. Despite a long-standing ODIHR recommendation, the legislation allows voters to be added to supplementary voter lists on election day without ensuring sufficient safeguards against misuse of this procedure. I would point out that the election code provides sufficient mechanisms for voters to request corrections, inclusions and deletions ahead of elections. Furthermore, early voting was possible, including over a holiday period. It is notable that only registered political parties can nominate a candidate, which is not in line with international standards. Therefore, the rules for registration of political parties are also relevant in the context of a presidential election. The legislation on party registration remains restrictive and the rules are applied rigorously. No new party has been registered in Uzbekistan since 2019. 4 candidates stood for this election, including 1 woman. All the registered candidates were able to campaign freely and were treated equally when it came to the production and distribution of campaign materials, organising of events, and access to public funding. Indeed, public funding is the only source of financing of a presidential campaign that is permitted by law. The presidential election took place in what could be described as a constrained political environment. The 3 opposition candidates all endorsed the incumbents' policies. The campaign was low-key, and those events that we were able to observe were generally held indoors in office hours. Often they appeared orchestrated and were mainly attended by public employees. The campaign regulations include some prohibitions against the misuse of administrative resources and the participation of state officials during campaigns. But a lack of effective safeguards to prevent public officials to misuse their position is still something that needs to be addressed. In the campaign, the introduction of social measures legislated by presidential decrees and announcements of new ambitious investment projects and social benefit plans provided an undue advantage of incumbency and blurred the separation between state and party at odds with OSCE commitments. Reforms aimed at increasing women's participation in public and political life have been underway since 2016, and the number of women in the Parliament has increased significantly, with women currently holding nearly 30% of all the seats. While women were well represented in the election administration, the higher the position, the lower was their representation. Gender issues did not feature prominently in the campaign discourse, and with the exception of the sole female candidate, they did not feature prominently in the campaign. As already mentioned, the campaign is financed exclusively from public funds. In addition to funding, candidates were also provided with in-kind funding, for example, the free use of premises for meetings. The financial provisions were reported as being sufficient by all the candidates and their representatives. The legislation requires interim and financial reporting on campaign finance to the Central Election Commission, but a lack of thorough and timely oversight and dissuasive sanctioning mechanisms impact on the effectiveness and transparency of campaign finance regulations. Ladies and gentlemen from the media, as you probably know, during this election, we also looked at the overall media environment, as well as undertaking our own monitoring of how media covered the election, which is in line with our standard methodology. Legal provisions, in particular related to defamation, false information, and extremism, disproportionately criminalise speech contrary to international law. Recent arrests, detentions, and convictions based on these provisions, including for the use of social media, de facto limit freedom of expression. While there is certain space online for the discussion of social issues, interference with editorial autonomy and self-censorship impede criticism of high political authorities. The state-owned media outlets provided free airtime and space for contestants in line with the law. Editorial coverage of the campaign was rather limited, however, and the incumbent received disproportionately more news coverage, providing an undue advantage. Overall, media did not facilitate a critical public discourse on political alternatives, undermining the voters' ability to make an informed choice. There were 2 presidential debates during the campaign, but none of the candidates appeared in these in person. They were all represented by their proxies. Let us move to the topic of complaints. So the law grants broad legal standing to all stakeholders and guarantees resolution of disputes within reasonable deadlines. According to the Judiciary, Prosecutor's Office and Ministry of Internal Affairs, no election-related complaints have been received so far. Of course, our mission remains in Uzbekistan for 1 more week, and we will be following any election-related complaints and appeals, which we would then reflect in our final report, and we expect to publish this in about 3 months' time. For complaints and appeals to be dealt with effectively, an independent judiciary is required. And we know certain recent legislative and practical measures that have been taken to improve the independence of the judiciary, but it is still undermined by insufficient safeguards. According to some of our interlocutors, the low number of election-related cases being filed is symptomatic of a lack of public trust in the judiciary. The law allows election observation by observers from international organisations like ourselves. In fact, I think almost 800 international observers were accredited. Also, political parties, Mahalla committees and media are able to observe the process on election day. But despite long-standing ODIHR recommendations and contrary to OSCE commitments, the legislation does not contain provision for observation by citizen observers. As nocturne observers, you can see, ladies and gentlemen, how much of our observation actually took place before yesterday. But in order to be able to follow election day itself, our team increased in size to over 220 international observers. Yesterday we started before 8 AM to see preparations for opening of polling stations. We then observed the voting itself in the whole country, making nearly 1,000 visits during the day, completing on every visit very comprehensive observation forms and sending them in real time for analysis by our statisticians here on the 4th floor of this building. We also attended and observed the count at individual polling stations and then went on to follow the tabulation, which is the summarising and aggregating of the regional data at the district election commissions, with the final data coming to us, to our office here, until the early hours of the morning. But by the time we were presenting this to you here, we have all the data from all of our teams, wherever they are located in Uzbekistan. So sometimes this is the thing, the part of the election that excites observers the most. And indeed, election day is always unique and exciting. So I will go into maybe a little more detail on what we actually saw yesterday. Well, the election day was calm, I would even say rather quiet, but our observers negatively assessed the voting process in a significant number of polling stations, with the administration of the voting process observed as bad or very bad in 13% of observations. The process was impacted by shortcomings, including serious irregularities, including large numbers of voters added to supplementary voter lists without proper safeguards, voters who voted without proper identification or on behalf of others, and compromises to the secrecy of the vote. Furthermore, in a number of polling stations observed, indication of ballot box stuffing, as well as numerous observations of seemingly identical signatures on the voter lists were noted by our observers. The closing and counting process was assessed negative to a great degree in 39 of the 87 polling stations observed for the count, due to significant procedural errors, omissions, and disregarding of reconciliation procedures. We then went on to follow the tabulation procedure, and this was negatively assessed in nearly half of the election district commissions visited. The major problem here was that our observers were simply not able to get close enough to observe properly the tabulation process. Overall, the counting and tabulation processes raised questions about whether ballots were counted and reported honestly. Throughout the day, our observers consistently noted discrepancies between the number of voters casting their ballots and the officially reported preliminary turnout figures. Our estimates of turnout were lower than the official figure. Ladies and gentlemen, it is positive to see that the reforms of the legal framework did take on a number of our previous recommendations and observations, but the realities of the election campaign, with the absence of political competition and existing limitations to freedom of expression, as well as the shortcomings and irregularities observed yesterday, make it all the more important that Uzbekistan takes bolder measures towards a true democracy that includes all of its citizens. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention. It was quite long, but I know there's a lot of information to cover. I will pass the floor back to my colleague Elma, and we're happy to take questions.
Ambassador, thank you very much. As said, we are happy to take any questions, especially from journalist side. Please, before you ask questions, state your name clearly and the media outlet you represent. Please.
I can start. We have mics, yes.
Here in the front row, please.
Thank you. I'm Navbahor Imamovaning from the Voice of America. Happy to start this interesting process. We had a very intense conversation with the Central Election Commission this morning, which, as always, insisted that the yesterday's process was as democratic as possible. in today's Uzbekistan, which very much contradicts what we hear from the public, what we have been hearing from the public ahead of the elections, as well as yesterday. And I myself was at maybe nearly 10 voting centers. Earlier in the day, we saw more crowded places than later in the day, and it got more crowded again towards the end of the day. And in Tashkent, in a very interesting way, the Central Election Commission this morning said that they observed the least active participation, but it is still at 73%. So, you know, Uzbekistan definitely goes above 70, even when they mean passive participation. But this is a very serious matter, right? I mean, you just said that your turnout estimate is lower. Could you please elaborate on that? Like, where do your estimates stand? Because right now, what we're hearing from the Central Election Commission is that out of the nearly 20 eligible voters, nearly 16 million of them were out yesterday voting, which is again something that, you know, the public doubts and expresses deep, cynicism about.
Thank you very much for your question. I'm not going to give you a figure because we would need a significantly bigger sample than 1,000 to say something definitive. But there seemed to be a discrepancy that became quite apparent. And how we check, we have 2 or 3 questions that all of our observers at the polling stations are required to fill in. So they tell us how many people have voted when they arrive. We assess the flow of voters coming in during the observation that they are there. Our observers don't just jump in for 5 minutes with a clipboard and they're out again. They spend half an hour, 40 minutes if necessary. So they do have an opportunity to see the flow coming through. They look at the voter lists, they look at the ballot box, they can see if this is, if this looks right. But also when you come to the reconciliation, so the normal procedure is when the polling station is closed, when the counting begins, you must first of all safeguard all unused ballots, and you must check the number of signatures against the number of ballots physically in the ballot box. It's the first primary check. So in some cases that didn't happen, and sometimes we saw discrepancies. I came back to our statisticians, very experienced, on a couple of occasions and said, you know, can you give me something more concrete? And again, they were also reluctant to say a figure, but we did not see something as busy. And we, as I said, we were everywhere, and we were also there throughout the whole day. So we also, I think, noted when I looked at the figures, it was naturally busier in the morning, and then it kind of plateaued during the day. I hope that answers your question.
That's quite accurate. Thank you.
So Voice of America opened the floor. Do we have more questions from journalists here in the room? Yes, I see.
Hello, President Otus. In the previous report of the results of 2021 election, the OSCE noted that authorities should guarantee in practice a clear separation between the state and the party. Should be an effective mechanism of sanctions against the abuse of administrative resources should be created and applied. How do you assess the level of the use of administrative resource by the current president?
Thank you for your question. If people didn't hear it, it's this question that we have in the past made reference to misuse of administrative resources. If my deputy will correct me, it's not something we highlighted particularly, I think, during this observation. But there is another advantage that the incumbent has, and that is if just before an election you, for example, by presidential decree, can gift things. You know, you give tax breaks, financial support for specific groups, and also big promises of major investments bringing jobs. So this is something that an incumbent generally has, and election promises are of course the norm and everybody makes them, but it's actually when you distribute benefits to your population very close to an election that of course you gain an advantage over your competitors. But in terms of the misuse of administrative resources, Masha, I call upon my deputy. I don't recall it was a significant issue, this observation. It is reflected in the report, but it's not something we particularly noted.
Good afternoon. My name is Navbahor from Dalia House. My question is, it's known that OSCE Bureau of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights participated in 20 and 21 presidential elections in Uzbekistan as foreign observer. And it's in the report of the result of the election. The Bureau noted that the election was held without any serious competition. During the election campaign, none of the candidates criticized about the program of the current president or asked questions about his work as a president. And it can be said that almost the same situation was repeated in yesterday's election. There was no competition at all, and everything was predictable. Citizens are even not interested in this process as before. I mean, does the fact that the last two presidential elections weren't held in fair and transparent manner mean that Uzbekistan has slowed down its steps toward building a democratic state, or has it started to retreat from this path and take a step back?
Well, to say whether Uzbekistan takes a step back or a step forward would require us to compare one election to another. And as a policy and in our methodology, we don't do rankings, maybe like some international NGOs which give rankings and then you move up a couple of notches or move down a couple of notches. We don't do that. We take every election as a standalone event. The only thing that we take and comment on from our previous reports and observations are the recommendations. So you probably noticed that during my presentation, I made a couple of reference to recommendations we had made in the past. Some of them have been addressed, some remain outstanding. So to say better, worse is not something that we do as a matter of policy. You'll also be interested to know we do not compare country to country. But this lack of vibrancy in the campaign and the competition, yes, when you read our report and you see some of the sometimes very interesting things can be found in the footnotes of our reports. We were getting reports from our long-term observers. We were actually only able to observe around 41, I think exactly, election campaign events. That was often because we couldn't find them. We found out on social media after the event, but not before. Many of them, of course, took place indoors, which is understandable when it's 40 degrees centigrade outside, but they took place in office hours, and we had reports from our observers that it looked as if some of these things were a little orchestrated. So we even had instances of questions being handed out to the participants, for example, or police not allowing people who had not been invited to come, which is not really normal in a campaign, because you would want to invite as many people, let as many people know that you're campaigning, and also deal with whatever questions they spontaneously wanted to ask you. So I think when you read the report, you will see the debates also using proxies without the candidates themselves campaigning. So it was quite low-key. Of course, it was visible on billboards and materials were distributed, but generally low-key. And please don't get me wrong, I'm not about having negative or hateful campaigns, but constructive criticism and challenging different perspectives is what is typical of a a vibrant campaign.
Before we take this question, I just wanted to remind the participants on Zoom that if you have any questions, which we also take, to do it in the question and answers box, because there could be maybe a misunderstanding, but please, go on.
First of all, I would like to thank you for the representatives for first conference and the information involved in it. And I'm Yevropada Xavfsizlik from .uz, I'm sorry. Uzbekistan has a reserve of experts certified by the Bureau, and over the past period since Uzbekistan became a member of the OSCE, observations shows that Uzbek experts were involved in the missions as short-term experts and only in the CIS countries. And here the question arises that why are specialists from Uzbekistan not being involved as long-term experts? Also, Uzbek experts are not involved in monitoring elections in European countries. Are there any informal restrictions or that kind of internal regulatory, I mean the prohibitive rules of the organization? Thank you.
Let me just, I'm not quite sure I understood. Did you have a concern that there were Uzbek nationals observing this election? No. So just to clarify, yes, my deputy tells me. So just to make it clear, it is an international, the international observers. We do have local staff supporting us here, of course, in our day-to-day work, but the observation is carried out by internationals. Now, as far as citizens of Uzbekistan observing elections in other participating states, we always welcome from every one of the participating states international observers to join missions. Of course, with the exception of the one that takes part in their own country, you cannot be an observer of your own election. And sometimes some countries have greater budgets, quite honestly, and are able to send more observers or more willing to send observers. We never allow domination by any particular nationality, and we also, as far as I know, it still operates, the Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights has a special fund which allows underrepresented countries, observers from underrepresented countries, to join and be funded directly by the ODIHR and not by their own state. And my colleague reminds me that recently in Latvia we did have observers from Uzbekistan. So we would hope to see as many of young, active civil society members from Uzbekistan also coming and gaining that experience of observing elections wherever we are. I mean, we observe elections here, but I have observed elections most recently in France and also in the United States. So it's the same rules apply for everybody, and you would be very welcome on a mission.
Thank you, Ambassador. Do we have more questions? Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Parizot. I'm from Habarus, and I have one question. As you know, there are limited and full-fledged mission of the OSCE Office for Democratic Institution and Human Rights that observe elections in more than 58 countries around the world. In recent years, only full-fledged mission of the organization have visited Uzbekistan. However, there are limited mission to most countries in Europe, or there are cases where the organization doesn't send mission at all. Again, this background, the question arises on the basis of what criteria decision is made on the type of missions to be sent to certain countries.
Thank you. That is a very good question, because sometimes there is confusion about the various formats. So as soon as an election is announced, and in the case of this presidential election, snap election, The office, which is located in Warsaw, had to act very quickly, but in its normal standard procedure. And so experts come, our desk officers, directors, come from the ODIHR staff in Warsaw, and they conduct numerous discussions, often meeting with the same people that we meet a few weeks later on our missions, assessing what is needed, what kind of mission is needed, how many observers should be sent, should they just be long-term observers, or should they also be short-term observers. And this is called a needs assessment mission, and indeed there are some instances where it is decided not to send anybody. Sometimes a very small group, 2-3 experts, might go for an expert mission. We might have just a team of experts without long-term observers. This was the situation, for example, last year when I was observing the parliamentary election in Paris. In France, it was just an expert team. Quite often, though, we have a limited election observation mission. This is kind of one notch smaller than this one, where we have the experts in the capital and a team of long-term observers. And this was what we have in the United States, for example, in 2020, mainly actually due to COVID then. But it's a formula that we see in many countries. And then when it comes to what you call fully fledged, I would say the one that includes both the long-term and the short-term observers, Uzbekistan is not an exception. We have had, for example, these kind of full election missions in an EU member state, in Hungary. So it is not something that is reserved, I would say, for this particular region of the OSCE participating states. Every election, every situation is assessed separately, and a decision is made to deploy what will be the most effective and useful mission. And they also decide, how many long-term, how many short-term observers. So I can assure you there is no discrimination.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions here?
Can I ask another question? Yeah, I promise it'll be very. Yeah, I promise this will be very brief. So one of the things we heard again from the Central Election Commission today was that they reiterated that they follow your recommendations, but they selectively do that. They actually highlighted that part, saying that we don't have to follow all the recommendations and we know better. And those people who live here, who breathe this air, they said, verbally translating it from Uzbek, we know better. So observers are great, we love guests, let them come, let them see what we're doing here. Yes, we have issues, but at the end of the day, we know better. That's the attitude. And one of the pieces of improvement they highlighted was the fact that the representatives of the presidential candidates, the 3 nominees, they debated throughout this process. Did you watch those debates? Are you assessing that as a piece of progress, as the Uzbek side claims it to be?
Well, yes, we did, of course, watch the debates because we followed very closely 5 TV channels. I mean, we have some very square-eyed observers sitting 2 floors up from here who've been doing nothing but watching television for the past month. We also followed 5 online newspapers, effectively. And we also had some monitoring of social media, but mainly of social media of political parties, of candidates, state institutions, where actually the level of engagement and interest was fairly modest. But coming back to your more important question of the recommendations. Well, first of all, our recommendations are not compulsory. OSCE is not this is an organization which recommends, these are not prescribed. So it is always up to the participating state, at whose invitation we are always here to observe, to select and take on those recommendations they feel that would be most useful for them to do. Our recommendations are not prescriptive. They are quite worded in a way. We're not giving you a kind of, we give nobody a blueprint or an exact roadmap how they should achieve this recommendation. We just send the general signal of the general direction we would like to see things developing. And yes, we always realize that every one of the participating states has its very unique history, very unique institutions, very unique traditions, and this doesn't just apply, for example, to Uzbekistan. I mean, these are discussions that I have with authorities in many of the countries where I observe. So for us to write recommendations, we aim to be sensitive to the local situation. We try to harmonize maybe something we already find here, but of course we must harmonize it with the international commitment and the standards to which the countries have committed. And it's not an easy task. We give a great deal of thought to the wording and the choice of the recommendations, because we would like to give recommendations in a way of their wording and their direction that they have a realistic chance of being implemented. And as you can see, we have made recommendations and they have been taken on board. And no matter if they're big or small, every one of those is always a source of satisfaction to us, because we know that we have made a positive contribution to bring the democratic process a little bit more into line with international standards.
Здравствуйте, уважаемые гости. Меня зовут Мурат Масудов, я блогер-правозащитник, член объединения СГУЛИ по правам человека Узбекистана. Много интересных задают вопросы в соцсетях. Нам тоже интересно, если дадите информацию, как обстоят дела в закрытых избирательных участках. Это в следственных изоляторах, в тюрьмах, местах заключения, специальных медицинских учреждениях, войсковых частях. Наблюдатели международные были допущены к этим участкам, и как обстоят дела. И насчет выборов не было бы принуждения со стороны комиссии избирательных. Хотели бы узнать об этом. Спасибо.
We are aware that there are closed centres, prisons, of course, medical facilities, care homes, but we generally do not go into those places. That doesn't mean that we're not interested in what is happening in those places. So actually one of the very interesting meetings I had here was with the head of the penitentiary services to discuss how the voter rights of prisoners would be respected in prison. And we received a very comprehensive reply. We even tackled very practical things, like many long-term prisoners find that their IDs expire while they are incarcerated. And so when it comes to election day, you need a valid ID. And we were assured by the Ministry of Interior that there were instances of prisoners whose IDs had expired, but that they had been renewed for them, allowing them to vote. We were also assured that the prisoners had access to campaign materials. So while we did not observe directly what was happening within the prisons or the closed polling stations, we do have a very, I think, broad section which would give you a fair indication of what was happening on election day without actually going into the closed centres. But as I pointed out, this is something we always discuss, and in one of my meetings with the head of the penitentiary service, we discussed this in quite considerable detail.
Thank you for your question, but please keep in mind this is a press conference for media primarily. So, I mean, if we have maybe a last question from journalists, we would take that, if there is any left. Okay, so then if there are no more questions, thank you very much for your interest, your participation in this press conference. You will get copies of our preliminary statement when leaving the room, but please keep in mind we have a dedicated website to this mission where not only the statement is published, but also the interim report, and most important, the upcoming final report will be published there as well. And all these reports and additional information on the mission, but all the reports you will get also translations into both Russian and Uzbek language on these websites, and more information, as I said, on the mission. So please use this opportunity to get maybe also further questions answered. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and have a very good afternoon.
Thank you. Bilamiz, shu paytgacha ingliz tilida tomosha qildingiz sabr bilan. Endi ozgina sharhlab beramiz. Hozir qanday bu yerda xulosalar qilinganini Yevropada Xavfsizlik va hamkorlik tashkiloti tomonidan, va albatta keyin biz yana bu idora rahbari, ya'ni bu missiya lideri bilan ham alohida suhbat qilishni rejalaganmiz. Endi hozirgi umumiy xulosaga agar keladigan bo'lsak, ya'ni kecha O'zbekistonda bo'lib o'tgan prezident saylovlarini bu xalqaro tashkilot, ya'ni asosiy kuzatuvchi missiya qanday baholaganiga to'xtaladigan bo'lsak, bir necha xulosaga urg'u bermoqchimiz. Birinchidan, bugun ertalab Markaziy saylov komissiyasi, agar biz O'zbekistonda yana bir demokratik saylovni o'tkazdik, u barcha demokratik tamoyillarga monand binoan kechdi va jiddiy xatoliklar kuzatilmadi degan bo'lsa, mana hozir biz Yevropada Xavfsizlik va hamkorlik tashkilotidan buning aksini eshitdik. Ya'ni kechagi jarayon ko'plab demokratik talablarga javob bermadi. Albatta, qaysidir darajada progress bor, texnik jihatdan yaxshi tayyorlanilgan saylovga, lekin ovoz berishga kelganda va kampaniya olib borishga kelganda u yerda jiddiy kamchiliklar bor deb. Birinchi navbatda qancha odam qatnashgani bu yerda savolga tutilmoqda. Ya'ni Yevropada Xavfsizlik va hamkorlik tashkilotining kuzatuvchilariga ko'ra, Markaziy saylov komissiyasi bugun aytganidek, ya'ni agar mamlakatda 20 millionga yaqin odam ovoz berish huquqiga ega bo'lsa, ulardan 16 millionga yaqini kecha saylovga chiqdi degan gapni biz eshitdik. Nafaqat O'zbekistonda, balki xorijda. Mana shuni hozir Yevropada Xavfsizlik va hamkorlik tashkiloti shubha ostiga olyapti. Ya'ni bularning taxminicha bu qadar ko'p odam chiqmagan saylovga. Hozir bu yerda bir narsani to'g'rilab olmoqchiman. Facebook bilan bog'liq, uzr, chunki bunga albatta biz e'tibor berishimiz kerak. Mana endi to'g'ri ko'rinayotgan bo'lishi kerak. Mana shu hozir savol ostida aytganimdek, ya'ni o'zi saylovga qancha odam chiqqani. Endi kecha mana biz ham saylov uchastkalariga borib kuzatdik va ertalab va kechga yaqin saylov uchastkalarida odamlar ko'proq bo'lganini aniqladik. Va albatta o'zim ham kecha lavha berganimda, masalan, Toshkent shahrida ayrim saylov uchastkalarida masalan 1 soatga yaqin vaqt mobaynida ham hech kim kirib chiqmaganini biz ko'rdik. Albatta buni narigi tomon inkor etadi, unday emas, odamlar faol ravishda qatnashdi deydi. Endi lekin baribir saylovchilarning o'zi biladi. Yana misol tariqasida aytadigan bo'lsam, kecha kim bilan gaplashmay ko'chada, taksida bo'ladimi, do'konda bo'ladimi, yo'l-yo'lakay bo'ladimi, saylovga chiqdingizmi deb so'radim. Lekin masalan 30 kishidan so'ragan bo'lsam, ularning aksariyati yo'q, chiqmadim deb javob berdi va yo'q, chiqmadim deganlar yoshlar asosan. Ular birinchidan bergan ovozining natijasiga ishonmasligini aytishdi, ikkinchidan baribir Mirziyoyevga ovoz bergan bo'lardim, Mirziyoyev esa baribir qayta saylanadi. Ya'ni mening ovozimning ahamiyati yo'q degan gaplarni ham aytishdi. Endi undan keyingisi saylov kampaniyasi qanday kechgani bilamiz. 3 nomzod bo'ldi. 3 nomzoddan biz ko'p eshitmadik. Eshitganimizda ham bu nomzodlar amaldagi prezidentni savolga tutishgani yo'q, uni tanqid qilishgani yo'q. Menga ovoz bering, prezidentga emas. Biz ishni unga qaraganda yaxshiroq qila olamiz. Bizning partiyamiz bu ishni hozirgi prezidentdan ko'ra yaxshiroq eplay oladi degan gaplarni aytmadi. Endi mana hozir Yevropada Xavfsizlik va hamkorlik tashkiloti missiyasining rahbari aytayaptiki, biz bu yerda janjal bo'lsin, qandaydir bir mojarolar bo'lsin demayapmiz, lekin siyosat bu kurash maydoni va turli fikrlar maydonga chiqishi kerak, bahslashilishi kerak va shu tariqa jamiyatdagi turli fikrlar tinglanishi kerak deyapti. Va albatta bu yerda debat bo'lgani haqida ham hozir mana o'zim so'radim. Ya'ni nomzodlarning 3 nomzodning, prezident Mirziyoyev emas, qolgan 3 nomzodning ishonchli vakillari debatlar olib bordi. Va albatta bu yerda tabiiy bir savol tug'iladi va buni biz media sifatida berib kelyapmiz. Agar prezidentlikka nomzodlarning o'zlari debat qilmasa, bu qanchalik ahamiyatli? Ya'ni prezidentlikka nomzodlarning debat qilmasdan ham boshqa yana muhim ishlari bo'lishi mumkinmi? Agar xalqning ko'ngliga yo'l izlayotgan bo'lsa, nima uchun ular o'zlari chiqib debat qilishmayapti? To'g'ri, ular band bo'lishi mumkin, turli tadbirlarda bo'lishi mumkin, lekin nahotki debat uchun vaqt topilmaydi bu yerda? Ya'ni bizning ularga beradigan savolimiz shu. Lekin mana saylovchilardan o'zim so'raganimda ular qo'l siltashdi. Ya'ni bu odamlar kimki, ular debat qiladi, chunki baribir ular saylanmaydi-ku. Ya'ni prezident Mirziyoyevning saylanishi aniq-ku. Ya'ni ularni ovora qilishdan nima foyda degan fikrlarni ham eshitdik ommadan. Endi mana bugun saylov komissiyasi a'zolariga yuzlashganimda va ularga omma ularni demokratik yoki mustaqil organ deb bilmasligini eslatganimda, albatta ular buni inkor etishdi va meni jamiyatni yaxshi bilmaslikda tanqid qilishdi. Ya'ni media bilmaydi, siz 3-4 ta odam bilan gaplashib omma fikrini xulosalay olmaysiz deyishdi. Lekin media hamisha jamoatchilik fikrini o'rganadi va har bir insoniy fikr bu yerda bebaho. Agar Markaziy saylov komissiyasi a'zolari ularning individual fikri hisobga olinishini, jiddiy baholanishini xohlasa, demak fuqaroning va saylovchining ham fikr va mulohazalariga shunday qarashi kerak. Albatta biz O'zbekistonda 36 milliondan oshiq odam yashasa, ularning har biri bilan intervyu qilib chiqa olmaymiz. Biz kelib jamiyatni o'rganamiz. Qolaversa, biz O'zbekiston jamiyatini yillardan beri yoritib kelyapmiz. Ya'ni Markaziy saylov komissiyasi demokratik va mustaqil organ emas degan fikr kechagina paydo bo'lib qolgani yo'q, yoki bu hafta boshida Amerika ovozi O'zbekistonga kelib material tayyorlashni boshlaganidan beri eshitganimiz yo'q. Uni biz yillar davomida eshitib kelamiz. Hatto hukumatning o'zida ishlaydiganlar buni aytadi. Hatto Markaziy saylov komissiyasida ishlaganlardan ham buni eshitganmiz. Ya'ni albatta rasmiylar o'zini himoya qiladi. Buni ham tushunamiz. Bizning vazifamiz savol berish, ularning vazifasi javob berish. Biz qabul qilamiz, buni axborot sifatida ommaga yetkazamiz, lekin mutasaddilar medianing savoliga javob berishi uchun mediani yerga urishi, uni o'z ishini to'g'ri qilmayotganlikda masalan ayblashi bu ortiqcha. Chunki media nima qilayotganini biladi, rasmiylar ham nima qilayotganini biladi. Biz bir-birimizga aql o'rgatish dek bir avtoritetga ega emasmiz bir-birimizga nisbatan. Lekin bilaman, O'zbekistonda hukumat jurnalistikani o'rgatishni yaxshi ko'radi, jurnalistlarga qanday professional bo'lish borasida hamisha yo'l yo'riq berib keladi. Xuddi O'zbekiston hukumati o'zi biror bir jihatdan professionaldek. Endi bu mening jurnalistik nolam. Endi mana Yevropada Xavfsizlik va hamkorlik tashkilotining xulosalariga qaytadigan bo'lsak, ko'plab demokratik talablar bajarilmadi bu saylov mobaynida, ya'ni saylov kampaniyasida ham, ovoz berishda ham, ovoz o'sha ro'yxatdan o'tkazilayotganda, ovozlar sanalayotganda juda jiddiy kamchiliklarni biz topdik deyapti. Endi bu hozirgi dastlabki hisoboti va keng qamrovli hisobot chiqadi va albatta missiya bu hisobotni O'zbekiston tomon bilan muhokama qiladi va endi O'zbekiston tomon hamisha eslatib turadi, biz o'zimiz tanlab o'zimiz xohlagan tavsiyalarni olib ularga amal qilishga harakat qilamiz deb. Endi muddao oxir oqibat katta bir savol shuki, umuman olganda O'zbekiston xalqiga, O'zbekiston jamiyatiga bunday missiyalardan nima foyda deb. Endi Yevropada Xavfsizlik va hamkorlik tashkilotining o'sha prinsipial agar pozitsiyasini tahlil qiladigan bo'lsak, ular a'zo davlatlarda demokratiya tomon qadam tashlanishini xohlaydi va astalik bilan bo'lsa-da tizim yaxshilanishini, oshkora bo'lishini, fuqaro manfaatlari uchun xizmat qilishini xohlaydi va missiyalardan maqsad shu. Lekin shu bilan birga ular kelib har bir saylovni kuzatib, hukumatlarning boshiga urishni ham odat qilmagan. Ya'ni Birlashgan Millatlar Tashkilotidan ham shuni eshitamiz, Yevropada Xavfsizlik va hamkorlik tashkilotidan ham. Ya'ni kelishadi, kuzatishadi va buni hukumat xohlashi kerak, taklif qilishi kerak, tavsiyalar beriladi va tavsiyalarning xohlaganiga hukumat amal qiladi, xohlaganiga amal qilmaydi. Yana qator savollar bor va biz mana missiya rahbari bilan muloqot qilganimizda yana buni bafurja gaplashamiz. Hozircha mana shu yerdan eshitganlarimizning qisqa po'stkallasi deylik bayoni edi. Hozircha shu Toshkentdan bizni kuzatishda davom eting. Siz uchun tayyorlayotgan materiallarimiz ko'p. O'zbekistondan aloqadamiz. Fikr va mulohazalaringizni kutib qolamiz. Toshkent markazidan saylov natijalari 9-iyul kuni o'tgan O'zbekistonda kechgan prezident saylovlari natijalari haqida Yevropada Xavfsizlik va hamkorlik tashkilotining demokratik institutlar va inson huquqlari byurosi missiyasidan eshitgan xulosalarimiz bilan tanishdingiz. Toshkentdan men Navbahor Imamova. Omon bo'ling, jonli efirimizni shu yerda to'xtatamiz.